Welcome to Warehouse for Conversations with the Industrial Property Team. I'm Matt Osowski, SIOR, and today I'm joined by Ryan Aiello, partner at Dinsmore, Shohl, Columbus office. Ryan specializes in real estate and works with lenders, borrowers, buyers, sellers. But today we're going to be talking about tenants and landlords, and Ryan's going to walk us through some industrial lease provisions. Thanks, Ryan. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be here.
Absolutely. So what I want to do is kind of go through sequential order of lease. You and I have worked on a couple deals together, so this should be pretty straightforward. So let's start at the beginning. Certificate of occupancy. We are starting to see this come up more often than not, and it often falls through the cracks during lease negotiation, but really becomes critical when it's time for the tenant to move in. So who is typically responsible for obtaining that C of O? And is that the landlord's responsibility or the tenant's responsibility? And what are some best practices to ensure compliance and avoid any delays that can impact that tenant's occupancy?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Default answer is, well, who's responsible for doing the work? Is the landlord doing the work or is the tenant doing the work? Whoever's responsible for the work is generally responsible for getting the CO. Does work need to be done? I think what really becomes important and what I'm seeing a lot of these days is what is the work? What's the scope of work? And what needs to be done before you can get the CO? It's critical that the tenant, and the landlord should know generally what is and isn't allowed, but for the tenant especially, the way leases are written, you basically take the building as is, aside from landlord's work. And landlord's work is going to be very narrowly defined, a list of 5 items and however many items, and it'll typically say, anything else that's needed is on the tenant. Mm-hmm. Well, the issues that you run into there is if you don't hire an architect up front and understand what is and isn't allowed, that scope of work can balloon to something that no one anticipated or that the landlord sort of knew about and the tenant had no clue on. Mm-hmm. It's coming up a lot in the commercial space. City of Columbus especially is becoming hyper vigilant on what is or isn't allowed, either outside the building from a storage perspective, or inside the building, especially with racking and warehousing stuff and sprinkler fire suppression. It's a huge issue. So I would implore tenants to do due diligence up front and for you guys to hook them up with the right architect that can figure out those issues.
Yeah, we're seeing it time and time again. For years, in my RFP still does state that when I'm representing a tenant, my RFP states that the landlord's responsible for obtaining that C of O, and we don't have much luck on getting that agreed to in the proposal stage right now. So that makes sense.
Yep.
All right, we'll move on. So now we have a general idea of how to get a CO. Lease commencement. There are multiple ways to define lease commencement, right? Is it upon completion of the work or whatever it might be? And it gets really unclear when there's tenant improvements involved on when that commencement might be. So tenants really just want to ensure that they're not paying rent before they're able to occupy and operate their business. Right. So what language would you suggest to help tenants avoid that situation that, they're not in there paying rent while their work is still being done? And how would you define substantial completion of the work?
Yeah, so it falls back to that same point, who's doing the work. If the landlord's doing the work, then from the tenant's standpoint, it should be, all right, well, it's going to be a certain time period after the work is done. And hopefully you can put some parameters around that so that the landlord gets the work done in a timely manner, whether it's 60 days, 90 days, depends on what needs to be done. Typically, as a tenant, you're going to want rent shouldn't commence next day. You need a move-in period, whatever. So usually, 30 days is around the time after the landlord completes work, if they're the ones doing it, that you'd have a move-in period and then rent would commence after that. Okay. If the tenant's doing the work, it becomes...
this work gets tricky.
We're a little trickier and you got to negotiate it. And again, this is where you need to know up front, you got to have an architect, you got to have a contractor, you got to know how long this stuff's going to take. And some of it depends on what the contractor's schedule is, and he's not going to tell you until you tell him go. And if you're negotiating a lease, that can get tricky. But typically you're going to want to negotiate a free rent period during that construction time. So if it's, again, 60, 90, 180 days, whatever it is, obviously the landlord's going to want to minimize that. But at the same point, if the space has to be fixed in order to be occupied, then it's a fact that needs to be dealt with. So from the tenant's standpoint, it's usually, hey, how long, get from the contractor, how long is it going to take? Add as much time as you can practically add to it, and go back to the landlord and say, I need this amount of time, and then rent can start, 15 days after. I mean, theoretically, if you're in control of the work, you have a better idea, and you can maybe phase that move in a little bit towards the end as work's getting finished. So you wouldn't necessarily need a full 30-day period or whatever.
Okay.
But it's something to think about, and you need to know that up front. You can't sign the lease and figure it out after.
So quick follow-up to that. Do you see a ton of variation from municipality to municipality depending on that permitting process? Some that take longer. So if I'm doing a deal in XYZ municipality, I might need to account for 30 days of permitting, or if I'm doing it over here.
Yeah, absolutely. And that depends on the scope of work and everything else.
Yeah.
I mean, is it an easy job or is it a big job? I guess to answer your initial question, how do you define it? CO would be how you define it. Or, it needs to be tied to, the tenant legally being permitted to occupy and use the space. I mean, that is what it has to be tied to. But you have to take into that permitting into account. I've had a deal. It's not local, but it was in Florida. I mean, some municipalities take 6 months to issue the CO after the work's done because there's too much going on. They don't have enough inspectors. I haven't heard anything near that around here, but there is a time period that, inspections need to be done and then CO's issued. So that all, again, that's having a relationship with your architect and your contractor.
Yeah.
Them having the right relationships with this, whatever municipality is, and knowing what those time frames are.
Yeah. Okay. That's invaluable right there. Seriously.
No, absolutely.
So let's move on to TI allowance. Ryan, tenants, they're often unclear on how a TI allowance works. And, if it's your first or second lease transaction as a tenant, they often think that the landlord's just going to write them a check.
Give them money.
Yeah, that's not how it works. So can you explain, what's a common acceptable payment terms for a tenant for a TI allowance?
Yeah, so again, it depends on the scope of work, the project, and the time period. Is this something that takes 60 days? And typically, I guess backing up, what a landlord's going to start with is, hey, when the project's done, I'll give you the money.
Right.
Now, if it's a 2-month project, that might work. If it's a 6-month or 9-month project, that's not going to work. Your contractor's not going to wait for that. And he's probably going to want something up front too. So the tenant's going to have to manage that sort of cash flow situation and go into it expecting that they're not going to get monthly draws. Now, is that something that's negotiable? Yeah. I mean, if you can get a landlord to agree to a monthly draw, that'd be great. Typically, they're hesitant to do that. I've seen, usually you can kind of negotiate it based on percentage completion, 50% and then 100%. You can get them to release some money. Obviously, from the landlord's perspective, they don't want to start shelling out cash and then something happens and the work's not done and they've paid for half
a project.
That's right. So that's why they want it, at the end, and there's a push and pull there. I think typically you can get to a good middle ground there.
Yeah.
As long as everybody knows going in, okay, what's expected, how much is this going to cost, and landlord's got to be realistic too. Like, unless the tenant has a line of credit or something, they're not going to be able to float this for a long time period. So
right, especially if it's a high build-out cost.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So
we'll move away from the improvement aspects of a lease here a little bit. Let's talk about maintenance and repairs, which can be real tension point between tenants and landlords. Let's just start, and let's clarify what you think landlords' core responsibilities are for maintenance and repairs in a typical industrial lease, and then inversely, what would the tenant's core responsibilities be?
So I think it starts with what the product is. Is it a single tenant building or a multi-tenant building? Single tenant building, I think a landlord's going to want tenant to do a lot more of the exterior maintenance. You know, there's no true common areas because tenant,
it's their building.
It's their building, yeah. So the landlord's always going to want more control over, and it cuts both ways because then you have the cost aspect. But, you know, structure, roof, foundations, mechanical systems, you know, from at a base standpoint, you know, the landlord's not going to want the tenant just messing with stuff. And that's on both sides, either multi-tenant or single tenant. You know, on a multi-tenant, you're going to see more like common areas. The landlord's going to take more responsibility to actually do the maintenance of stuff, exterior, you know, mowing, snow removal, exterior maintenance, everything. The tenant typically in any scenario is going to be responsible for day-to-day interior maintenance, mechanicals, that kind of a thing. Where you get into the push and pull is who pays for what. You know, most people view operating expenses as, you know, the stuff that needs to get done for the property to operate. They're not really thinking about, well, what if a roof needs replaced? Is that truly an operating expense or not? What if the parking lot needs totally resurfaced versus just plowed? You know what I'm saying? So that's where you get sort of a push and pull, and it depends on, you know, length of lease term, property type, a lot of other things. We can get into that.
Do you guys see yourself, I mean, we see in the industrial world, the parking lot is huge.
Huge.
And, you know, we see that get negotiated a lot. You know, if that lot needs to be replaced, who's responsible for it? Now, is it the tenant's trucks that have caused it?
Yeah.
You know, or is it just the age of the lot?
Yeah, that's right. So I think going into it, again, everything's fact specific.
Yeah.
When you're going into it, does the parking lot need replaced right away?
Right.
Well, then you're like, landlord, I'm not, you know, this thing's
It's already gone.
It's already gone, you know, whatever. But to your point, are you using it? Are you wearing it down? Theoretically, then, as a tenant, you should be contributing to the cost to fix it.
Yeah.
So that's where, and again, length of lease term depends. Is this a 5-year lease or is it a 20-year lease?
Yeah.
On a 5-year, I'm going to be pushing more on the landlord, and I think the landlord's going to expect, yeah, well, I'm not going to try and charge somebody for something that's, you know, a long-term kind of has a 20-year useful life. If it's a longer-term lease, as the landlord, I'm going to be pushing more of that cost onto the tenant. Like, hey, you guys are supposed to be here for 20 years.
Yeah.
You've got renewal options, 10-year renewal options. Like, you know, pretty much everything's going to be on you.
Yeah.
You know, so.
Do you often see, you know, that useful life clause?
Yeah.
That's a good one to touch on, actually. We're seeing that used quite frequently when it comes to the parking lot.
Yeah, absolutely, especially on shorter term leases, like I said. So it's not fair, you know, for a tenant to get stuck with a huge replacement cost in the last year of a lease or on a short term lease. So typically what we end up negotiating, and again, this is one of those spots in the lease that always gets heavily negotiated, is this replacement cost concept or capital replacements. You know, at a minimum, you know, you want to try and get it amortized over the useful life of the improvement. So if the improvement's a 20-year HVAC unit or whatever it is, and you've got a 5-year term, maybe you're paying for 5 years of that.
Yeah.
Again, it depends on who I represent and what I'm going to push for, but there's other, you know, things you can do from the tenant side to try and protect against that kind of a thing.
Yeah. Ryan, one of the most fundamental but often confusing aspects of industrial lease are the operating expenses. When you're reviewing lease documents with clients, how do you define controllable versus non-controllable expenses? And if there is a cap that is negotiated, do you typically see it on all expenses or just the controllables?
Yeah, it's typically on just controllables. And so that's what's controllable and what's not. If you ask a landlord, nothing's controllable, right? Especially in today's environment, inflation on every service that a landlord gets is, you know, they can't, I mean, they will say they can't truly control it. The historic definition has been your non-controllables would be property taxes, insurance, utilities, and snow and ice removal.
That's
right?
typically what we've always.
Landlord can't control. Everything else is controllable. Now, it depends what chair you're in, whether or not you agree with that, but that's sort of the base where you would start with on the negotiation. And, a landlord's going to try and put more in there. And, again, usually you can find a happy medium there. In terms of the cap, those controllables or those non-controllable items I mentioned would not be included in a cap typically. And, the cap is negotiable. Typically, we see, 5% is, 3 to 5% is where the negotiation is. And then you have like a cumulative versus non-cumulative cap. So a landlord's going to push for a cumulative cap, which basically, so let's say it's 5% per year. Well, if 4 years have gone by, that's 20%. They could throw 20% at you in year five. Versus the other way, it's 5% per year. So they can only go up
to 5%
in any given year. Correct.
Okay.
So,
and that would be non-cumulative.
That's correct. Yeah. So anyway, that's another push-pull between the landlords and the tenants. Landlords usually win on that one, but again, you try. You're trying to get what you can.
Okay.
So.
All right. Let's stick with the sublease terms. Often include language regarding landlord's approval, which cannot be unreasonably withheld. What items do you typically see that can be reasons for the landlord to not approve sublease?
Yeah. So, generally the landlords are going to start saying no subleases without our consent. You throw in, you negotiate and throw in the not to be unreasonably withheld, and then you get into the actual circumstances. So what is it that a landlord might or might
What's
not
unreasonable
want?
here?
Right. Change in use is an obvious one. Changes in the building that the landlord might not want or might feel like, well, then I'll get stuck with this is another one. Financial wherewithal is another one. Rental rate is one. Are you renting this out for more than I'm renting it to you? And then I want to be able to recapture some of that rent, or you got to turn that over to me.
Yeah.
All those things can be negotiated in various detail depending on, where you're coming from and what the lease is. But those are typical reasons. And I think, from a landlord's perspective, hey, when I signed a lease with you, it was with you. Like, I didn't expect somebody else
other guy
to be coming in. On the flip side, if I want my rent to be paid and I know you're struggling or you don't need all the space and you need some help to do it, I should be open to a similar user as long as everything else is equal.
Yeah.
Someone else to help supplement this rent so I can continue to be paid.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's typically what we're
So
seeing.
let's stick on that real quick. So we often see equal to or greater than financial strength. Would that apply to the tenant's financial strength at the beginning of the term, at the end of the term? Like, what's a reasonable request from the landlord to compare the subtenant's financial strength to the existing tenant's financial strength?
That's a good question. So again, it depends on what you can negotiate. Usually there's a fair market net worth sort of standard that we'll put in, and you could argue that it's at the time the lease started. So the argument from the tenant's side there is, hey, well,
you accepted this.
You accepted how I was at the time. So as long as I can bring somebody else in that's similar to me at the time, you should be fine with that. The landlord, if then the tenant has increased its net worth substantially, and now I've got a bigger fish on the hook, the landlord's not going to want to go back down to where it was. So again, it's a push-pull. I think most of the times this is something that gets negotiated fairly easily, but it's a great point. It's something that you have to consider, and especially from the landlord's perspective. So
let's talk about holdover rent.
Yep.
Here's a topic, it often creates some anxiety with tenants, and it's sometimes tenants look at it as like a punishment, like a punitive clause. But from a legal and practical perspective, what's the actual purpose of holdover rent? And what would you say is a reasonable holdover percentage that's fair to both sides?
Yeah. So to me, it's not a penalty, it's an incentive to get something done, right? So it's the same as like an attorney's fees clause. Like, If you're stuck paying attorney's fees, you're more incentivized to reach a settlement, a negotiation, or whatever. So that holdover clause, it's the landlord's trying to incentivize the tenant. Hey, if you want to be here, you got to sign a lease, you got to renew, we got to come to terms, whatever. Otherwise, you need to be looking for other space. I don't want you dragging this out forever, so I'm going to charge you 100x% times what you're normally being charged until we work it out.
Yeah.
And it brings everybody to the table and forces that negotiation. We typically will see anywhere between 200% on the high end to, I'd say, 125% on the low end.
Yeah.
From the tenant's perspective, if you can, I think 150 is the middle ground. If you can get down to 125%, somewhere in there, you're doing all right.
I would agree with that.
But, from the tenant side, and we might be getting into this too with some other questions, but they need to be talking to their broker and thinking about this proactively.
Yeah.
Don't wait until there's 3 months left in your lease and maybe I should reach out to the broker and find out what I need to do here. It's too late.
That early discussion about renewals will be the hill I die on.
Yeah.
Man. So, we preach it every single day.
Yeah, you have to get ahead of it. Yeah.
Here's a scenario that, business owners don't really like to think about, but what happens to their lease if the property is sold? Worst case scenario reverts back to the bank in a foreclosure.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through what rights a tenant would have in that situation? And is the lease still enforceable with the new owner or lender? And how can tenants best protect themselves when negotiating that initial term?
Yeah. So it depends on, one, whether or not the mortgage or the financing was in place prior to or after the tenant signs the lease.
Okay.
If it's there before the tenant signs the lease, it predates the lease, the landlord or the lender has priority and can foreclose out the tenant. The way most leases are written anyway, they're automatically subordinated to financing. So again, in that scenario, arguably the lender can foreclose out the tenant. From the tenant's perspective, what you can do is request a non-disturbance agreement from the landlord / the landlord's lender. It's common, so it's an SNDA, subordination, non-disturbance, and a torment agreement. Everybody agrees, hey, the lease is subordinate to the mortgage, but as long as I'm paying my rent, I won't be disturbed. I think that's critical for a tenant to think about and for the brokers to remind tenants about as they're going into a lease. Hey, let's start talking about this now. Is there a mortgage in place and we want to get an SNDA from the landlord? Flip side is, well, if a lender's foreclosing, is it really going to want to kick out tenants? Maybe, maybe not.
Yeah.
Depends on what they're paying. If it's a 20-year lease and they're 10 years in and the lease rate's in a rising rent environment, if the lease rate is low, that lender's going to be looking to, hey, we can pressure these guys to either amend their lease to pay market rent, or we can get rid of them and get somebody else in there. So it's vitally important that a tenant thinks about that and negotiates that as part of the lease negotiation. I'd put that right up there with having the architect, having the contractor, thinking about all these things. It's one of those upfront protections you kind of got to do.
Yeah. And then if the property is sold, we've seen almost every industrial property in our market change hands in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
What happens in those situations?
Yeah, on just a regular sale, there's no change. There shouldn't be any change for the tenant other than who you're paying your rent to. The new owner basically inherits the lease, takes the lease on as part of their property, so there shouldn't be much change from that regard. The more concerning time is when there's a lender involved and there's a foreclosure. That's when it gets a little dicey.
Okay. We touched on renewals a little bit before, but as I mentioned, that's the hill I'm going to die on, so I'm going to go after it again.
Yeah.
So on renewals, we used to see typically a single deadline for exercising, which would be for years, it was 6 months prior to lease expiration, the tenant must provide landlord written notice to renew their lease. Now we're seeing landlords requesting 12 months or even more time than 12 months that the tenant has to provide notice. And from a broker standpoint, that's really hard to go to market, to look at the market, negotiate with a new landlord when you're not going to be paying rent for 12 months.
Yeah.
So can you explain what an ideal renewal structure would look like from a tenant's perspective and what you think would be a fair window for renewal?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great one. I mean, there's two perspectives to it. Or the landlord's thinking, hey, I need as much notice as possible so that I can get this place rented out again in as quick as time period as I can and not, have it sitting vacant. Tenant's perspective, it's what you just mentioned. Well, if I have to give this much notice and I want to leave, how am I going to get a new lease signed up that far ahead of time? What's even going to be available by the time this rolls around? So I think, usually where it ends up is that 6-month mark. I think that is kind of the sweet spot. It gives the landlord enough time. It gives the tenant should know by then.
Yeah.
Again, I think it's working with your broker early. I don't know.
Yeah.
You're probably talking to them early. I would say 18 months ahead of time.
Yeah.
Like, you got to start thinking about it. Are you guys thinking about leaving? Where are you going? Or what do you need? And communicating with the landlord too. I mean, those, maybe you can get some soft extensions of those deadlines one way or the other. But it's on the landlords too. Shouldn't, I'd be reaching out to the tenant 18 months ahead of time too. Like, hey, by the way, your renewal, coming close to the end of your year. Do you plan on staying?
Yeah.
So hopefully if there's a good relationship there amongst, landlord, tenant, brokers, you can kind of figure it out and get to it. But yeah, that's a tougher one. I guess I would say that 6 month, you don't want to go too much farther than that if you're the tenant, and if you're the landlord, you definitely don't want to go too much lower than that. So, if at all. So
that's a tough one. And we've really, since the market has tightened in the last 4 years, like I said, it was years that 6-month mark was just there. It was almost just a set in stone thing. And then like the last 4 years start getting pushed further. Landlords are pushing it further and further out.
Yeah,
so.
right.
Okay, so we've made it pretty well through a lease at this point.
Yeah.
Let's address lease termination and restoration obligations. At the end of a lease, tenants are typically required to restore the space, back to its original condition with some minor wear and tear reasonably accepted. But wear and tear is often interpreted very differently by landlords and tenants. What's the best way to establish that transparency around the obligations at the beginning of the lease so both parties can clearly understand what the tenant's responsible for upon termination?
Yeah. So there's two things here. The first one is how are alterations going to be treated? So you have to make sure as a tenant that before you do alterations whether or not you're going to have to remove them.
Okay.
The way most leases are written, the landlord can require you to remove alterations if it so chooses at the end of the lease, which you don't want as a tenant. And you can avoid that, I think, as from both sides. Like, hey, I'm going to give you notice about what I'm going to build. I'm going to give you my plans. If you approve that, then I don't have to remove it at the end.
It's staying.
It's staying. And really, you have to negotiate up front prior to entering in the lease, whatever your TI is for your anticipated use, that's pre-approved. You're not going to require me to remove any of that at the end. That kind of work can be crazy expensive, depending on what the property is and what is going into it and what. Anyway, so you have to avoid that. And to me, that's a fair compromise for both sides. Everybody should know before work's being done whether or not it's going to stay. The wear and tear thing, to me, it's like you got to leave the property the way you got it.
Yeah.
So document it. How do you take videos, take pictures, just make sure everybody's on the same page and you have a record of what it was when you got it.
Yeah.
The wear and tear thing for industrial properties, it can kind of go.
It can be dicey.
Yeah, it can be dicey, right? I mean, you can beat something up pretty good. So I think
there's no way that column was dented 4
inches. Yeah, that's right. That's right. So I think you just got to be prepared for it, and again, document it. That's from both sides, from landlord side and tenant side. Everybody should be motivated to have a record of what it was when it was turned over.
So with the tenant alterations, the tenant having the ability to leave the alterations, is it an all or nothing situation, or could it be, when that scope of work is agreed upon?
Yeah.
Would the landlord have the ability at that point to say, okay, well, I'm okay with this office space, but you're going to cut a pit in my warehouse floor, you're gonna have to fix that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Like going in on lease inception, I think the understanding has to be, well, it doesn't have to be, but it should be, hey, I don't need to remove any of this. This is why I'm taking the space to do this.
Yeah.
Unless there's an agreement that, yeah, that hole in the floor, I'm going to let you do it, but you got to put that back.
Yeah.
But that's the same way throughout, especially like alterations that are being done, halfway through or as part of a renewal. Again, it's the discussion. What are you doing? I can live with all that stuff. I like all that stuff. I don't like the hole in the floor. You got to fix that. So as long as everybody knows going into it before up front before the work's done, either lease inception or if there's stuff being done at a renewal point or midstream even, hey, landlord gets to review the plans. Landlord can say, I like this, I don't like this. This is what I'm going to require you to remove. What you don't want as a tenant is, hey, I'm going to let you know at the end. That's where you get stuck.
Yeah.
And that's no good.
Got it. All right. Ryan, this has been incredibly valuable. It's been fantastic. Anyone who wants to get in touch with you, how could they get a hold of you?
Yeah, so Dinsmore and Shohl here in Columbus. I guess the easiest way would be dinsmore.com.
Perfect. Or reach out to me. I'm happy to send Ryan's information along.
Yeah.
Thanks again, Ryan, for your time today. And thanks everyone for joining us on the warehouse floor. Please let us know if you have any additional guests or topics you'd like to hear about. And remember, every deal is different, so stay informed.